Hi, everyone. I think it's Tuesday. Happy Tuesday to you. We're here for our weekly live stream to discuss, I don't know, any and everything, all things legislative for sure. We just wrapped legislative session on this past Friday. It was a very busy legislative session. It was a good legislative session. In some ways, and then in other ways, it was a huge missed opportunity. Um, I think that this was our first legislative session in a few years where we didn't have Governor DeSantis's thumb on the scale. And so it seemed like it would have been a great opportunity to focus on big issues impacting Florida's families. We know that Floridians are facing an affordability crisis right now with property insurance rates through the roof. We know that it's difficult to find an affordable place to live, whether you're renting or whether you're buying a home and trying to attain the American dream. We know that things are hard right now. And so, from the perspective of the Florida House Democrats, you've heard me say this often that we believe that every Floridian deserves the freedom to be healthy, prosperous, and safe. And that certainly includes the ability to afford a home to live in a home that you can afford. It means that you shouldn't have to choose between whether or not you buy groceries or you can afford your health care. It absolutely must mean that you deserve to be safe inside your home, inside your school, inside your place of worship, living in a community that is free from gun violence. And so while we had every opportunity as a legislature to come together and to focus on those big issues, we simply didn't do it. We simply didn't do it. I mean, there were more culture war bills, and maybe they didn't make as big of a splash as some of these bills have in the past. But what you need to know is that it was not really a better legislative session than what we've had before. It was a session that was rife with missed opportunities. I guess where I'm proud this legislative session is in terms of how hard the Florida House Democrats fought for each and every one of you, how hard we fought for Floridians, speaking truth to power, making sure that we were holding our Republican counterparts accountable as best we could, pushing for transparency, pushing for fairness, right? Like pushing for equity. There was a bill actually that we debated. It was House Bill 1291. And I can't even believe that I have to report this to you because you would think that as a legislature, we would have better things to focus on. But this was a bill that was designed to control even what teachers can be taught. Yeah, teachers, like grown people. It is really restricting what teachers can be taught as they learn about different curricula and as they build out their curricula for their kids. And it says that you cannot teach them distorted history, which includes learning about things like structural racism and just the history of racism in America. And it was just stunning to me. My caucus fought so hard. We had really good amendments trying to really understand. So, are you saying that we can't teach about Jim Crow? Are you saying we can't teach about Japanese internment camps? What exactly is distorted history? Because we know that there's been such an effort with the Republicans who've been in control to try to hide America's history, to not try to address it head on, to really try to sugarcoat and whitewash some things. And we know that parents don't like that. Parents want their kids taught accurate history. And I think in order for our kids to be taught accurate history, that certainly has to start with our teachers being taught accurate history so then that can translate into the classroom. I posted my debate on this bill. I know it's up on X. I'm not sure if we posted it on the other platforms, but let's just say it caused me to get very passionate as I think about my mom, who taught public school for over 35 years, each and every day in and day out, working so hard to make sure our kids had a great education. My mom, who grew up in the segregated South, and still was able to dig deep in her heart and in her soul and find something to offer to the young people of this world and try to build up the next generation. Just the thought that that history couldn't be taught accurately to a teacher, to me, is it doesn't make any sense, right? We want Florida's kids to be able to compete not just with other kids in our country for the jobs of tomorrow, but globally. We are now in a global society. And we don't want Florida as a state to become associated with wrong-headed policies that leave our students, frankly, at a disadvantage. So that's the type of culture war stuff we had. There were a couple of highlights. I'll tell you, I was honored to fight for our historically Black colleges and universities to get resources that they need for school hardening, because we saw with the shooting that took place in Jacksonville, that shooting actually started on Edward Waters College's campus. Edward Waters College is a historically Black college and university, and it had a number of security gaps. And so we want to make sure that our schools get the funding that they need to help protect their campuses and keep the students safe. We also fought for unprecedented funding at the state level for sickle cell disease. Sickle cell is a very painful disease. It tends to impact, or Florida has one of the highest populations of patients with sickle cell. And with this legislation, we're creating sickle cell disease centers of excellence so that patients can get the care that they need. And the budget also provides for $10 million recurring funding for treating those with sickle cell. This is huge. We've never seen a commitment like that from the state. So I was honored to work on that legislation with Representative Kelly Skidmore out of South Florida. So there, a few things good going in the budget. We'll have to see what happens with the governor, because he still has a veto pen. He doesn't have to allow all this stuff through, but we certainly fought for it. Also fought for $250,000 in funding for a study on maternal health and infant mortality. We know that America's maternal health rates are abysmal. I mean, they're really just going in a downward trend, and we don't really understand what are all of the causes and indicators for that. So being able to study that in Florida, in which has rates for certain populations, including Black mothers, that are worse than the national average. We want to understand what's going on so we can try to take care of our families. But yeah, like I said, a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of focus on, I don't know, everything but property insurance and housing affordability. I mean, these are the number one issues of facing families in our state, and we just could not get the attention on it that we needed. But boy, did we try, and we fought hard. So I wanted to bring you that update. And I'm so glad to be back home in district and back in my community post-session. I missed y'all. For those of you who are my constituents or who are here in the Tampa Bay area, I'm just glad to be back home and ready to, frankly, get started on election season, because we need to come back with some more Democrats in these seats, because that's the only way we're going to restore balance in the legislature. Things are too far out of balance. Democrats are in a super minority, which means that Republicans don't need our votes to pass anything, and that's not okay. When you look at the population of Florida, it's much more evenly divided, and so we certainly need a legislature that reflects the breadth of diversity that we have as a state, and not just racial or gender or sexual identity or anything. I'm talking also just like diversity of thought, right? We have a lot of Democrats, we have a lot of independents, and we need to make sure that those voices are represented in the legislature as well. And so, on our weekly live streams, we like to bring you fantastic guests and riveting conversations. And for many of you out there, you know that I developed a passion for African American cemeteries. And let me tell you about how that started. In 2019 or so, through the reporting of the Tampa Bay Times, a reporter, Paul Guzzo, there was an old Black cemetery, the Zion Cemetery, that was rediscovered. There was a time where even Americans were segregated, even in death. Even when we were buried, we had to be segregated. And so there would be these African American cemeteries. And Zion, actually, the land exchanged hands multiple times. At one point, the folks who sold it knew that there was a Black cemetery on that land, but they sold it anyway. It eventually became acquired by the Tampa Housing Authority, who built a housing development on top of it, Robles Park. And then it was just kind of like lost to time. And then there was this excellent reporting by this reporter who was like, whatever happened to the cemetery? He found it. And that sparked a lot of interest in, okay, if this could happen in Tampa, couldn't this happen in other places in the state? So I was honored to champion legislation along with then Senator Janet Cruz to try and establish a statewide task force to look into this. It took us 2 years, but we did it. Then the task force had recommendations that we tried to get signed into law. It took us 2 more years, but we did that too, because you have to be tenacious in Florida if you want to get anything done. So we were able to pass legislation that actually established the Office of Historic Cemeteries in the Florida Department of State, and it dedicates $1 million per year to projects for restoring such cemeteries and research, genealogical research. As you can imagine, cemeteries are very important to people's heritage, to the heritage of various communities. And I think that transcends, I should say, race or ethnicity or anything else. Everybody understands the importance of honoring our dead. this work has brought me into contact with with many amazing people, but two really amazing gentlemen who we have as our guests tonight. The first is Willie Tolliver. He's Dr. Willie Tolliver, but he told me to call him Willie Mama. So got to make sure I don't get in trouble with Miss Terry Driscoll. But Willie Tolliver is a professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in New York City. His interests are the impact of colonization and coloniality on indigenous people of African origin and their descendants in the United States. This work is now extended to rescuing the historical memory of resistance to enslavement and domination by people of African origin and other indigenous peoples in the United States, and those whose resistance resulted in them leaving the USA to live free. And so let me bring to the stage our first guest, Willie Tolliver. Hi, Willie. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. And then our next guest is Jeffrey Shanks. Jeffrey Shanks has been a professional archaeologist for over 2 decades. For many years, he managed the National Park Service's Archaeological Assistance Program for the Southeastern region. Currently, he works as a private consultant and provides technical assistance to nonprofits focused on cultural heritage and historical preservation. Let me bring to the stage Jeffrey Shanks. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for being here. I've really been looking forward to this, and for the audience, had the opportunity to meet with the two of you during legislative session, hear feedback from you about, the abandoned cemeteries legislation, what we can do to make it better, and then hearing from you, Dr. Tolliver, about the experience with you trying to even uncover information about cemeteries where some of your loved ones may be buried. So maybe actually, why don't we start there, Dr. Tolliver? Why don't we hear about your background? I mean, you're from Florida. You are from our state. You understand about the time when it was segregated. So what brings you back to Florida, and what's your passion in these cemeteries?
Thank you so much for inviting me. What brought me back to Florida, I would always come to visit. Our mother lived until 2003. And so I would always come to visit Apalachicola, my home in Franklin County. But what brought me back this time was July of 2020. The school had closed down because of the pandemic, and I could teach from any place in the world using the Zoom. And I'm the last of 9 children. And at that time, there were only 3 of us alive. And I wanted to spend time with my sister Vernice, who's actually watching this evening with Frenchie in Apalachicola, and our sister Janelle. Janelle has since passed on, so it's only Vernice and I who are left. And we grew up in the segregated community created by Plessy v. Ferguson. Went to colored Catholic school taught by nuns from New Orleans, Sisters of the Holy Family, all Black nuns, in an elementary school and a middle school. The classes went from 1st to 8th grade. Then I spent 3 years in a public school for Black children. We were called colored at that time. Mm-hmm. And my last year of high school, attended Chapman High School, which was a school previously only for white kids. Graduated from there and went to FAMU, and from FAMU to Columbia to get a master's degree, came back, worked in Tallahassee, lobbied the legislature for the Florida Center for Children and Youth, and then went back to get a doctorate when I started working for Florida A&M University, and Dr. Humphreys, who's also from Apalachicola, Florida, became the president and insisted that I go to get a doctorate. There's a great story about that too, but we don't have time to get into it. But I came back in July, and 3 Black women had started this organization to memorialize the history of people of African origin in Apalachicola, because like most communities where African American people lived during segregation, those areas are being gentrified. I don't like to use the word gentrification, because I think it's really not what's going on. If you purposely under-resource a community and not provide the things that a community needs to be strong, integration actually removed the economic base that African Americans were forced to establish for themselves during the segregation period. And people like myself and my sister, who's sitting in Apalachicola, we left, and many of our other siblings. So when I heard some people talking about cemeteries and what you had accomplished in getting this bill passed for abandoned cemeteries, I heard this from the 20th of May cultural bearers and Dr. Natalie King Pedroso. I thought this would be a great opportunity to act on something that our mother had often told us about. She and her parents came to Apalachicola around 1910. She was a 2-year-old. And they lived in Tilton, Florida. My grandfather, Pleasant Edwards, came to work for a lumber company at Tilton. He and his wife, Sally Beth Hills. And they lived there in Tilton. And around 1918, my mother told us that her father was murdered. He was murdered and buried at Tilton Cemetery. And within a year, our grandmother, Sally, died as well. And so she's buried at the Tilton Cemetery. Our mother was a youngster, and the oldest sibling was about 16 at this time. And as you can imagine, they were traumatized, and they did not know how to reach their relatives. They had not gone to school because it was difficult to go to school from Tilton into Apalachicola. They had no vehicle. You would almost have to go by boat or either pay a taxi to drive you. And although I think you could probably get a taxi, I don't know about this time, but I know later for 35 cents to go anywhere in the county, but that was certainly not the case at this point. And here they are, these children, these 3 girls, and their 3 brothers. And so prior to my grandmother dying, she had learned to make moonshine, so they made moonshine. She taught them.
Wait, Willie, for the young people who don't know this,
yes,
what is moonshine?
Moonshine is a liquor. It's an alcoholic drink. It's white, typically, unless you age it in some kind of oak barrels. It can then take on a brownish color. And I understand that the aged moonshine is quite good, but it was probably not very good with these young kids making it. And that's how they survived. There was no public welfare back then. And even if there had been public welfare, it would not have been made available to Black people.
Right. So here they are in this dire situation.
Yes.
Parents have passed on, being raised by grandparents. And then what?
Well, they're not raised by grandparents. They're raising themselves because their grandparents are in Alabama and Georgia. Well, actually, at this point, it's my mother's family. So her grandparents are in Alabama, and they don't know how to get in touch with them.
Mm-hmm.
So her oldest sister, Leela, actually took care of them, raised them, and then by the time that my mother met our father, she was living in Apalachicola with the Ziegler family. And our father had come from Georgia, Pavo, Georgia. He was actually the last of his family, his parents' children, and his parents were actually born enslaved. His father was born in 1851 and his mother in 1859. So he didn't have much of an education either. So he comes there to work for a lumber company, just as my maternal grandfather did. He and our mom meet, and they marry in 1924, and have their first child in 1926. And our mother never went back to the cemetery where her parents were buried. Now that I've studied psychology and I understand something about the psychology of trauma, I can understand why she didn't go. It must have been extremely painful. I don't think she ever went back to Tilton in her entire life, and she lived until she was 94 years old.
Wow.
She was the last of her siblings to be here, and she told us that she always knew that she would be the last. She cared deeply for them, and many of them died young as well. In fact, 2 of her brothers died young, as well as her two of her sisters.
Now,
So
tell me-
all of my life, I only knew my uncle, Big Jim, we called him Uncle Ples, named for his father, and our Aunt Alice, who lived in New York City. And that's how I started going back and forth to New York City, thanks
So
to.
let me ask though. So always the family knew where the cemetery was. They always knew of the cemetery, but it was just the pain that kept them from visiting, right?
Only my mother knew where the cemetery was, and she never asked to go to it, and I never asked her where it was. So I didn't know where it was. I just knew it was.
You didn't know where it was.
Right.
Your mom passed away, but
Yes.
you knew then that the cemetery was out there, and then you embarked on a quest to find it. Tell us about that.
Okay, so when I got to Apalachicola in 2020, I became involved. I think this was all, as people, my mom would say, divinely ordained. I got involved with these three Black women who had started the North Florida African American Corridor Project. And they were memorializing the history, so I started to pay attention to history. I also hired a genealogist to help us find our mother's family because we knew nothing about her family other than her siblings and her Florida life. We knew nothing about the Alabama people. Since that time, our family tree went from like 200 people to over 1,300 people.
Oh, wow.
A huge family, a huge family. Her father had many siblings. I mean, I could talk for a long time about this, but you get the story. So I became interested in history because at this point in my life, I want to know. And I've been, I've taught for 30 years in a school of social work, and I realized how significant and important it is for people to know their history. And as I began to learn about our family and would tell other people, people ask me, how did you do that? Because I can only go back to 1940. Mm-hmm. We can go back to 1816 and 1814.
Wow.
Right. And then once I knew this information, I wondered, so can I find death certificates? And I did. And sure enough, on our grandmother's death certificate was written that she's interred, the body's interred in Tilton Cemetery. And I went to the courthouse in Franklin County. Mark Currington is a local historian, asked him where Tilton Cemetery is. It is now in a wildlife management area owned by the state of Florida. Mm-hmm. But I still didn't go. My sister and I and a family friend, Ms. Willie, went out. We drove around, but we didn't know where to go. We just drove, thinking maybe we would see a cemetery. We didn't. But I never got to go there until this past year, 2023, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Jeff Shanks, Dawn Lawrence, and Frenchie Haynes and I went looking for this cemetery. And it was in a field plowed for hunters to hunt. I think it's quail they hunt.
Quail. I was about to say quail in North Florida.
In this field.
So let me bring in Jeff on this part of the conversation because
Sure.
I think what Willie is describing, you're Dr. Tolliver, I'm sorry. What Dr. Tolliver is describing is you would think that it's unique, but this happens over and over again throughout Florida. And I know you have worked on uncovering multiple of these cemeteries. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about your work and how this is strangely and unfortunately common.
It's incredibly common. In 1999, the state, one of the first task force that the state created was actually back in 1999 to look into this issue. At that point, it was more of an exploratory task force, just sort of looking at the issues, more of just a case study, or looking at different case studies. What they determined was they estimated that there could be as many as 1,500 unmarked African American cemeteries across the state. Let me say that again, 1,500.
Yeah.
And even within that study, they said that's probably a conservative estimate. There could be many more than that. So my work as an archaeologist with the National Park Service, as you mentioned, I was with the Archaeological Assistance Program, managed that for a number of years. And what we did, we actually worked outside of national parks. We worked providing assistance to local communities, nonprofits, the state of Florida, on a number of different issues. And cemeteries like this, unmarked cemeteries, kept coming up over and over. And Dr. Tolliver's story here, I was honored that he let me come with him to help find his family's cemetery. And, for me, I've done this many times, and it's always like this. These cemeteries, they're hidden, they're in woods, they're overgrown, their locations are maybe vaguely known, but often the exact locations are not known. They have to be relocated. When you do find them, you may find one or two marked burials, but you know that there's many more that are unmarked. To give you a little bit of context, a lot of these cemeteries that we're talking about, for people that aren't familiar, these older cemeteries from the 1800s, early 20th century, they often had wooden headstones. Oh. And so just like you'd see in an old Westerns, right? That kind of, so envision that. Here in Florida, that wood rots away, within 10, 15, 20 years, there's nothing left. Right. And so that's a large part of the problem here. You may be lucky to have one or two graves that have a cement headstone, or maybe even marble. Sometimes that's rare. But often they were wooden. And so once they rot away, there's no real evidence of them. They quickly become overgrown. Like Dr. Tolliver said, in many cases, these are in marginalized communities or African American communities. They may have been tenant farmer communities or timber communities, like the one that Dr. Tolliver's family was from, and the populations move, they're transient, locations become lost. If we have knowledge of these cemeteries, it's usually
that I've learned though is that sometimes these cemeteries are we don't think of cemeteries as like a business, right? But there are plots of land that are sold for the purpose of these burials. And then sometimes the owners of these cemeteries pass away, or their kids to take over the business, and then this land can just can a sheet to the state, or maybe the local government just kind of lets it go, and a lot of times this land is left in limbo, or it can be sold, sometimes unknowingly but sometimes knowingly, that there actually is a cemetery there. So I think part of what's been so interesting to me is how these get lost to time, because as we sit here today in 2024, we can't imagine, like you drive by a cemetery along the street, you can't imagine that someone would forget that it's there or build over it, but this would happen all the time. And then could you talk a little bit, I know you worked on the capital city.
Yes.
Uncovering that cemetery at a golf course.
Yeah, that was one of the more high profile ones that I've worked on. And I think this is also a good example. Yes, sometimes these cemeteries are unknowingly forgotten. Sometimes they're knowingly erased. So let's be frank about that, right? Yep. And so this cemetery came to light almost exactly the same time as the Zion Cemetery in Tampa. In 2019. Again, there was some oral history knowledge that there was a cemetery present there on one of the larger hills there in Tallahassee, and where today there is a country club and a golf course. Originally, it was a plantation, like much of the land around Tallahassee. Tallahassee was the heart of the plantation economy during the antebellum period, and there was some knowledge, local knowledge that there may have been a cemetery there, but people were in denial of it. When I say people, people outside of the community that knew there was something there. And the cemetery itself was erased in 1937 when the city of Tallahassee bought this private golf course that had been on this plantation, and they expanded it. And this cemetery was wiped out when they expanded this golf course in the late 1930s. And yes, there may have been some missing headstones, but I find it hard to believe they didn't know it was there. There were still people living there that knew it was there. And today it is under the fairway of one of the holes on the golf course. Now, I'll tell you, this country club, it was a municipal country club. It was owned by the city of Tallahassee. So it was theoretically open to the public, if you're white, right? Because we're in segregated times here, right? In the 1950s, mid 1950s, when integration started to become a thing, the city leased the golf course to a private country club so that it wouldn't have to be integrated. They leased it for $1 a year, 99-year lease. So, as I'm sure some of you know, this is some of the stuff that took place in the South to try and fight against desegregation, to try and resist desegregation in very obvious ways like this. Now, obviously, things have changed now. The city of Tallahassee, is much more progressive than it was in the 1950s, and when this did come to light, the city was very supportive of trying to discover whether or not the cemetery was there. Was it more than just a rumor? Was it legitimately there? And I went out, I was meeting with a group of local citizens who took me out to the location where they thought it was. And for someone like me, where I've seen many of these, just walking across this fairway, nicely mowed grass where people are playing golf, and you can see depressions, all the way across, one after another. To someone like me, I see that, you can't unsee it. These are grapes, There was some resistance, but I ended up doing ground penetrating radar. We demonstrated there were at least 70 or 80 graves there. The city now has segregated that area off. And to their credit, they're actually working on not just protecting the cemeteries, but they're also working on an interpretation program. They're going to have interpretive signs out there, and they're going to be talking about the plantation, the history of enslavement in Tallahassee. And they're starting to tell the stories that haven't been told before. I think that goes back to your earlier points, that you were making at the very beginning of the show about this resistance to so-called distorted history. This is distorted history. The erasure of people's families, the erasure of cemeteries like this. And so, that's a large part of this. Each one of these cemeteries that's been lost or erased, each one of them has families. Each one of those families that are buried in there have stories, just like Dr. Tolliver was telling you about his family story, right? Every one of these cemeteries has people in there with stories, right, that have been lost or that are, that haven't been recovered, that could be recovered. And there's potentially thousands of these cemeteries like this across the state of Florida.
Which is horrible. And let me just get in here, because I think folks were really surprised. Now, I mentioned at the top of the show that we worked on the legislation for the task force, and that took 2 years. We worked on the legislation to get the recommendations implemented, and that took 2 years. Yes, it was an uphill battle, but what people might not realize is that for each of those bills, every time, both times, or all 4 times, I guess technically, the votes were unanimous. Even in a state with a legislature that puts out policies that can lend, frankly, towards the extreme in Florida, that can lend towards, not teaching history accurately, even with a governor who attacks African American history in Florida, we were able to get these bills passed unanimously and signed into law. Why? And I think it's because of something that Jeff just hit on, which is that these are stories. There are stories behind this. And when you are confronted with that, right, whether you're a legislator or whatever it is that you do in your walk in life, when you are confronted with that fact, it makes you think about your own grandparents, your own great-grandparents, your own family, your own heritage. And the thought that that could be done, that basically bodies could be desecrated in that way, that their final resting place could be disturbed or built over, right? Like there's something about us, I think, as humans, where, yes, we want that connectivity in life, but we also certainly understand what it means to honor those who are dead. The other thing that's great about this legislation is that it actually includes an education component to make sure that stories or that curriculum about these cemeteries gets woven into the lessons that we teach our kids about history, because it's a great access point. It's a great access point to talk about the challenging times in our state's past, because it naturally raises the question of, well, how could there have been, a Black cemetery that got completely built over, or the land got stolen, or, everything got erased. So I want to come back to Dr. Tolliver, because we kind of left left us hanging, right? Like you're at the property, you're looking for the cemetery. You and Jeff and a couple other folks are there. How do you realize, or at what moment do you realize that you're in the right place?
We actually thank God for cell phones. I had talked to this local man in Apalachicola, Polaronis, who owns property right behind where our parents had purchased property back in 1947. And he, of course, is nowhere near that kind of an age. But he told me, I know what the cemetery is. He told me this maybe 2 years ago, a year ago. And he offered to take me to the cemetery. And when we could not find it, I called him. I didn't have his number, but I looked up Polaronis, and I got his brother, and his brother said, okay, here is his number. He told me to go and talk to the person who is responsible for the wildlife management area. And thankfully, Jeff was with us, because my own trauma had me shaking in my boots. I'm out in the woods. There are dirt roads. I don't know anything about this area. And probably the reason and then, there's a horror story too, Jeff. I never shared this with you. One of our nieces, who is like twice removed, was murdered recently. When I say recently, in the past 15 years in this area. So I really I had some fear about being in these woods and going and knocking on someone's door, given what happens to Black people when they knock on folks' doors, and they don't know who we are. And we're not given that humanity. But anyway, we told Jeff, you have to go and knock on the door. Jeff went, and the person who answered, bless him, he was more than helpful. He stopped what he was doing and came and took us to the cemetery. And then going there for the first time was really surreal in many ways. I tell you, recently, just a few minutes ago, Jeff was talking about distorted history. The histories that are being taught in our schools are distorted. We can only get true history from oral histories of people who have lived this. Because the lived experience doesn't lie. What happened. Wow. And so having these voices now, it's as if those buried bodies there finally get voice in their grandson who's come to this cemetery. And we don't know where they're buried, because their tombstones were like the ones that Jeff described. They were wooden. There are only 3 graves there with markers on them. And the family recently put those markers there about 3-5 years ago. They knew, they were fortunate. They had someone who remembered where their loved ones were buried. And they went with that someone before that person died. I just wish that I had taken our mother, but it would have been difficult for her to get there, because that's the other thing too I want to talk about. These people didn't forget that these cemeteries were there. Life moved on. Many of the cemeteries, like the one where my grandparents are buried, were adjacent to lumber companies deep in the woods, turpentine steels deep into the woods where there were only Black and poor white people working, cotton fields deep into the areas. And so their family members left during the Great Migration. They never came back. They never came back. So they were not as fortunate as those remains at the country club. Right. As time moved on and life moved on. And so now you are back from the city, which is still wonderful and amazing to me as someone who left the state and went away to fulfill my educational dreams, but then came back thereafter because I wanted to give back to the community that had given so much to me, because I suffered no illusion. There wasn't that's right. There was that's right. And a community that helped.
How do you hope that the state's grant program for abandoned African American cemeteries can be helpful to you?
Yeah, I just want to thank you because I have some glimpse of your pedigree in terms of your education. And with that education, you could have gone anywhere in the world. We have a cousin who he didn't go to such a prestigious institution, but he had the history of what his grandfather went through to get the land in Georgia. This is on my father's side of the family. And when he was offered an opportunity to go work for Ford Motor Company, he said no, he stayed on the farm because he knew what his grandfather sacrificed to get that farm. But what I'm hoping that will come from this work that you and the legislature has made possible and the governor signed is that true stories like this, these stories will be celebrated.
Yeah.
And I agree with you totally. All human beings feel and they love. Part of feeling is loving, right? And so people have lost human beings. You don't get to live and lose and not lose people. People definitely have experienced that loss. And to not be able to take your child to a cemetery and say, this is where my parent is buried. This is where your grandparents are buried. And tell your child stories about that and actually inculcate in children a love for going back to visit these spaces so that they stay connected to who they are. And they pass on generationally the significance of holding on and keeping these stories alive. We were in many ways denied that opportunity. In many ways. And it wasn't because we didn't want to. Clearly, I mean, there are cemeteries here that they found down in Lower Manhattan, right? So even there, when those remains were removed and taken to Howard University, Howard University in Washington, D.C., and people got to see the amount of care that was put into these burials, right? Jeff was telling me about the decorative pottery, broken pieces of pottery that we found in the cemetery that we went to at Tilton, shells, all of these things that are consistent with African burial traditions are there.
Yeah.
To be able to touch that and tell those stories in the present, I don't know how we can make sense of the present without the past.
It's true. You can't.
You cannot.
You don't know how. It is absolutely because we cannot. It is, I think, essential to
absolutely essential.
Understand. Yeah, your context has no your present has no context, rather, right?
Thank you for that word. I work with that my students all the time on that. Context matters.
Context
matters.
matters.
You cannot make sense of the present without a context.
That's right. And then
I've dedicated my career to it, my life to this, to history, for that very reason. We can't understand where we're going if we don't understand the present, and we can't understand the present if we don't know how we got here.
That's
and
right.
not a mythical version of how we got here, but the
Mm-mm.
real story of how we got here, good, bad, and ugly. We have to acknowledge that. We have to understand it. We can't pretend. We can't distort it. That history.
That's right. And I think about it because I like to keep young people around me. They keep me energized. They're always thinking of things in a different way, right? And it's unique, and they're always on the edge of what's now. And for our young people, I also just fundamentally believe in order for us to have a brighter future as a state and as a country, they also need to know the past. They need to know and learn from those lessons, right? It never said that America was a perfect union. It says that we strive to become a more perfect union. And as we try to leave these things to our young people, as they rise up and their generation rises up and leads, it's important for them to understand the past too. So I just want to thank you both for being here. The time went fast. I had like a lot more questions for you, but the time went fast. And I thank you for joining. And I know that I will continue discussing these issues with you both in the off season. We know we have more work to do on this grant program, but I'm so glad that we were able to get the Tolliver family story out here so people can understand just what this means to families to be able to have that type of information and get that type of closure about where their loved ones are. I want to uplift the Oaklawn Cemetery, which is under Tropicana Field here in Tampa Bay, the Evergreen Cemetery, the Moffett Cemetery. There's so many. We talked about Zion. Zion was not a poor people cemetery. There were, folks of affluence who were there. You know what I mean? Like it's a mixed bag when you talk about these cemeteries and these lives that were forgotten. There actually is a Black military veteran who is underneath a cemetery that's underneath a parking lot here in Tampa. Right? Like certainly our veterans deserve better than this too. So a lot more work to do. I look forward to working with you both on this so we can continue to make sure that we're able to serve the community in this way. So Dr. Tolliver, thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. And thank you for your work.
Absolutely. So thank you all. I've been reading the comments in the chat. I appreciate you all for joining in. I know someone was asking for issues about legislative session and what happened, and we covered that at the top of the show, but maybe we'll continue to cover it in the weeks ahead and get into some additional specifics about what happened during legislative session. To me, it was a missed opportunity where we could have focused on big issues like property insurance rates, housing affordability, healthcare. We had this whole big healthcare package called the Live Healthy Act, but we didn't do the one thing that could help nearly 1 million Floridians who need access to healthcare, and that is expand Medicaid. Even the state of Mississippi is looking into expanding Medicaid because they realize they need to set partisan politics of time because the people need healthcare. So it's time for us to start having those conversations in Florida also. But man, I'm so grateful to Jeffrey Shanks and to Dr. Willie Tolliver for joining us tonight, because this work with abandoned cemeteries. I have to also uplift Senator Arthenia Joyner, who was the former Senate Democratic leader, who, as we were reading the stories coming out of the Tampa Bay Times about the Zion Cemetery, she thought this really should be legislation. And it was a pleasure to work with her on that, former Senator Janet Cruz, Senator Bobby Powell, to really get these bills across the finish line and to put something concrete into law that can help communities when they find these abandoned cemeteries. So please, we love to hear your stories. This is how we found Jeffrey Shanks and Dr. Tolliver to be our guest tonight, is that they shared their stories with me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear how policies are impacting you. You can visit my website at venturesforflorida.com and share your story. I want to hear them. It means a lot to me. It empowers me to go out and do legislative work that is impactful to you all. And so please share your stories. You can also send us an email at yourvoice@venturesforflorida.com. That's another great way to share your story. I want to hear about, whatever is happening in Florida that is impacting you. I know we get a lot of information about gun violence. We get a lot of stories about property insurance because it's really impacting people's ability to live a good life. If you like the content that we are bringing, I saw somebody ask in the chat, will we continue to do these now that session is over? Yes, I want to continue to bring these to you every week that I possibly can so that you can hear updates. Yes, more updates about legislative session, and I'm happy to go over more of the bills. If you have questions about specific bills, in fact, feel free to write those in because we can try to start covering those in the weeks ahead. But now that we pivot towards 2024, towards the campaign, I also think there's a lot to talk about because we need to talk about registering voters, making sure that our communities are turning out, because I do believe that this will be one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And we have to be prepared for it. And that doesn't mean starting to prepare in November, a week until the election. No, we need to start preparing now. So I look forward to sharing this space with you, continuing to share this space as part of our chosen community, to be in community with one another. Because I believe those of you who tune in every week, maybe you are starting to buy my theory of the case, which is that we are all connected through our stories. And we are so much than our geography, than our gender identity, our race, our religion, whatever it is. We are so much more than that. And our whole is greater than the individual parts. And I know that there's so many of you out there like I do who want a brighter future for Florida. We want a brighter future for our country. And we're all just trying to figure out what is our little individual part in that? And how can we put that together and have real impact and create lasting change? So thank you for tuning in. I think we can leave it here. I will see you next week, where we'll give more updates on legislative session per popular demand, and we can talk a little bit about election season 2. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you then. Take care.